Thank you for the opportunity to be here, and thank you for taking the time to come out tonight. What I'd like to do, and Graham's pretty well explained it, this isn't about the next election, it's about the Parliament we're currently in. There's a few things I'd like to explain in terms of the nature of this particular Parliament and some of the things that have been achieved in relation to this particular Parliament. And we can go into detail if people require. So please don't think I'm just sort of brushing over things. There's a great deal of information on a whole range of issues. But I do thank my staff for coming up. I particularly, as Graham did, recognise Lee is with me. Lee's probably the only man in the history of Australia that's actually served in two hung parliaments. Outside myself, I guess. He's been with me for 21 years now, and I have great regard for all of my staff. They're friends as well as dedicated to their work. But Lee has a special place in terms of in my political career, and I thank Bruce particularly for organising things up here. And to Graham and John and Jay who come to Parliament when Parliament's on. That's not normal. There's a couple of extras because of the hung Parliament. What I'd like to do is spend a little bit of time just talking about the nature of a hung Parliament. And I think everybody's aware of how hung Parliaments come about, so I won't get into that, but it's obviously that no major party has a majority in terms and is incapable of forming a majority government without the support of the crossbenchers. In this particular Parliament, the Independents and the Greens, and in the other Parliament that I was in back in 1991, it was my vote that put Nick Greiner into a minority government situation. So I had some experience in terms of the vagaries of a hung Parliament, the difficulties in terms of the government particularly negotiating a fairly difficult course in terms of the hung Parliament. And you may like to ask some questions on that a bit later. One of the interesting things that's come out of the debate since this particular Parliament's been formed is that if you listen to some of the shock jocks and a few others, mainly people who don't live in the country, they tend to run a line that this is an abnormality, that it's an odd arrangement to see country members of Parliament having the balance of power. Because what traditionally happens in a majority Parliament, irrespective of who the major party is that there are certain people who control them. And some people within the media may think they control them, particularly the city-based media, the Alan Jones of this world, those sorts of people who believe they have the power to intimidate and control the major political parties. That is not the case in a hung Parliament, and definitely not in this one, because it is country independents that have the balance of power, and they're not controlled by anybody other than their electors. The other thing I think people tend to overlook in terms of any Parliament is in fact the makeup of the Senate. And there may be some questions later on, about change of government potentially at the next election and what that means in terms of the national broadband network and some of the other clean energy issues that are out there as to the potential for change to occur with the Senate the way it will most probably look after the next election. Since Federation, and this will surprise some people, since Federation there hasn't been one Parliament, one government formed where a country member hasn't held the balance of power. This isn't an abnormality that we're living through, it could be normality. And in 21 years of politics, one of the things I've heard most often is, why are they doing this to us? Why is it always controlled by the cities? Why are the majority parties not listening? Why aren't they? All of those things, and you've all heard that before. There hasn't been a parliament since Federation where a country member hasn't held the balance of power. Now, why hasn't that been the case? And I'm not here tonight to denigrate any particular organisations, but the fact is that the major parties, the Liberal Party and the Labor Party, have country members or country affiliates in terms of the National Party or the Country Liberal Party or the Liberal National Party, depending on what they're called in whichever state you happen to be in. And they merge into those city-based structures. So you have a circumstance where country people, and sometimes they apologise for themselves in a sense, too much, I believe, when they say, oh, we only have 30% of the vote, therefore we will never be a majority, therefore we've got to accept what the majority parties actually give to us. And over time, I think some people have got to accept that and feel quite comfortable in terms of being able to be angry about it, what they give to us. That hasn't been the way it could have been. Country members, as I said, always had the potential to control it. It's just that they've never utilised that circumstance to their advantage. Now, in my view, that's not to abuse it, but it is to use it. And I think, irrespective of whether people agree with the minority government that's been formed or the way in which Julia Gillard's performed or Tony Abbott's performed or whoever, there's a significant lesson in terms of the way in which country politics can, and in my view, should be played. And that's to use the parliament more effectively. We've seen what the Greens have done over the years with about 7% of the vote. What could 30% of the vote do? An enormous amount, quite obviously. So 30% of the vote, if you do the arithmetic, and it's similar in the state of New South Wales, even though there's the dominance of Sydney in the political arena, 30% determines who out of the major parties governs. Now, there's been one party that's actually done that, in my memory at least, and that happens to be the Western Australian National Party. They found themselves in a hung parliament, 2.5 years ago, 3 years ago? About 3 years ago. And what did they do? Did they do what people... And they're a relatively small party, the Western Australian National Party. The Liberals have been trying to eradicate them for years. A little group headed up by a bloke in his 30s, a bloke called Brendan Grills. What did he do? Did he say, oh, well, we're just naturally aligned with the Libs, so we'll just put the Conservatives back into power and get what we've always got, very little? No, he didn't do that. He went into a bargaining arrangement with both the Labor Party and the Liberal Party and went very close to supporting the Labor Party in power in Western Australia. One of the things that he was able to achieve out of that, and very significant in terms of political achievement, and I've just chaired a fly-in, fly-out committee process, so we spent a lot of time in Western Australia looking at the impact on country towns of the fly-in, fly-out work practices. And one of the things that kept coming up as a positive, and it's the great credit of Brendan Grills and the Western Australian National Party, is a thing called royalties for regions. They were able to, in negotiating with both sides, leveraging their political strategy, were able to achieve billions of dollars to go back into country areas in Western Australia. And to me, that is something that I think we should all take notice of. Because if you maintain the interest in terms of being dominated by city interests, that's exactly what you'll get. And you've seen it today in Sydney, where Barry O'Farrell, and I like Barry, I've known Barry for 20 years, made a decision to put a moratorium or ban coal seam mining within 2 k's of houses in Western Sydney. Now, why did he do that? Not that he's terribly concerned about coal seam gas. He did that because Western Sydney normally determines who wins the elections, and they're petrified that an issue like that might escalate and have some federal ramifications. Normally, Western Sydney and Western Melbourne do determine who wins. But the point I make in terms of hung parliament and our political history is that country people could in fact do that if they untied their vote from any particular party or organisation. And with 30% of the population, they can dictate the terms virtually, history says, every time. Every time. So, this particular parliament has been an extraordinary one in a lot of ways, I think. And some people like it, some don't. But it's probably the best parliament that I've ever served in terms of the way the committee processes work. Now, you don't see the committee processes on television at night because they're about real work, not fantasy plays and question time. They're not about the one-line slanging matches that occur that you see. They're not about the shock jocks promoting a lot of the rubbish that they go on with. What the committees are really about is actually looking at real issues with members from all sides of Parliament and deliberating those issues. This is the best Parliament that I've seen in terms of the committee process. Now, why? The answer to that is that the executive of government, normally the majority, doesn't have control of the committee processes. And what that leads to is a freeing up of all members of Parliament in terms of what they actually say and represent in those committees. I've been chairman of the Regional Australia Committee. There's never been a Regional Australia Committee before until this Parliament. Never, which is a disgrace in itself. That committee has looked at Liberal, Nat, Labor, and Independent. No Greens. That committee has looked at a number of issues, a wide-ranging committee report into the Murray-Darling Basin, and one that was just completed in terms of the fly-in, fly-out work practice and how the positives and negatives that may have on the development and sustainability of country towns. All of the members on that committee are from country Australia. So there's no dominance of city interest. There is no dominance of government interest. They're a minority in the committee as they are in the Parliament. And that leads to a freer committee process in terms of issues. It's probably been one of the hardest parliaments in terms of the public viewing it because of the way question time and certain other parts of it are conducted. But the Parliament is about much more than those particular personalities that seem to prey on those sort of activities. Some of the issues that have come up, and I'll go through some of what I believe are achievements of the minority parliament in a minute, but some of the significant issues, and some of these did have an impact on my choice as to who I would support in the formation of a minority government. Now, the formation of a minority government, all that does is exactly the same as what happened with Nick Ryan. All that does is allow someone to form a government. It doesn't say that it maintains them in power. It doesn't say you've got to vote for them on anything if you don't particularly want to. What it does do, though, is give you the capacity to influence a whole range of issues, mainly behind closed doors. And I'll just give you a couple of examples. Caring for our country, some people might be interested in that. It's about 2.2 billion a program. You know, this current government was looking at, when they were on the surplus hunt, they're not there anymore, but was looking at removing that. Now that would have had incredible impacts on some of the natural resource management issues. We were able to stop that from happening. So it's not all about what you start and what you do and how much money you get. It's about policy and policy change and having the capacity to stop any nasties from potentially occurring. But two of the significant issues I think that had an influence on my decision was in fact the national broadband network and in fact the climate change issues. Now, I know people have views about, quite legitimate views about all of those things, and they're quite entitled to have them. The national broadband network, to me, is potentially the biggest piece of infrastructure and the biggest game changer that country communities will see this century. It relates to everything, whether it be health, education, business, entertainment, the works, agriculture, on and on and on. There are so many opportunities, many of which we don't even know yet exist, that will come with the national broadband network. And I remember having gone to Malcolm Turnbull in the very early days of this, and Malcolm was arguing that we should have a benefit cost analysis on this before it proceeds. And I said to Malcolm, well, okay, you want to have a benefit cost analysis. Let's start to talk about some of the what ifs. What if fibre to the home actually allows 100,000, 200,000 elderly people, 300,000 elderly people to stay in their homes for 1, 2 or 3 years longer because of real-time measurement of their health, their whereabouts in the home, their capacity to instantly contact their daughter and son and relatives thousands of k's away, in a sense, an internet blanket around them to protect them and give them some security. What would that do to a benefit cost analysis? And Malcolm said, oh, well, obviously it depends on what you feed into the thing that you come up with a number at the end of it. Just that one thing in itself, irrespective of any of the other health-related issues that are out there, that one thing, and the economy is going to go, Australia is going to go into a period of time in the not too distant future where we're going to have this massive bubble of older people wanting to be cared for, and the number of available to care for them is going to be questionable in terms of how you're going to fund that sort of stuff. So it's not just about, as Tony Windsor might say, I don't want to play games on the computer. There are very real economic issues. If you can smooth out that bump by giving people the capacity and the comfort to stay in their own homes and be monitored in terms of their health, and et cetera, which fibre to the home can do, you actually potentially have a massive economic impact, not only in terms of capital works for more aged care facilities, but also in terms of the cost of looking after those people. What we did with the national broadband network, and when I say we, that Australia has done, we actually sold Telstra, which I didn't agree with, I didn't vote for it, and I still think it was probably the wrong decision, but it happened. We sold Telstra for about $51 billion. $51 billion. Now, under current estimates, we're talking about this national broadband network being somewhere around 40 billion, 37 billion over 10 years. 27 or 20 odd of that, there'll be people who know the exact numbers here, will come from the taxpayer, and I think around 15 or so will actually come from the market. So the NBN it'll accompany the major shareholders of government, and then there'll be other funds coming from the market. So we sold the old car for 51 billion, and we're looking at buying the new one of this century for 40 billion. Now it'll probably blow out, all things do, the Opera House did. But just in terms of the capacity of the copper wire network compared to the fibre optic cable, it's just incredible in terms of the opportunities that exist. Now, where are those opportunities going to be mostly felt? In the country. In the country. Where health, education, distance, remoteness, you just scrap it. You've got contact with kids, your grandkids, who've got the capacity to use the technology to their advantage, to plug in with any university in the world or any school in the world. I've watched it in Armidale, where the medical school at Armidale is communicating with the University of California and actually watching live operations and people giving advice, etc. just incredible, the opportunities that exist out there. The other thing that the Hung Parliament has been able to do is normally the opposite of this. Normally, country people, because they're fewer in number, get the rear end of the steer in terms of the cost. And we saw it a bit with Telstra. You want a service, you pay a bit more for it. It's going to be cheaper in the cities. What we were able to negotiate with the current government, and I congratulate Stephen Conroy, people might have different views about him, but he believes in something. He actually believes in something, which is a bit of a change compared to Solomon. But Stephen agreed to have a uniform wholesale price right across the nation in terms of the national broadband network. Now that's like the postage stamp arrangement, where irrespective of how far the letter goes, you pay the same price. Well, that's the case in terms of the wholesale price within the three spectrum. And that gives country people not only an even playing field, but potentially a competitive advantage over their city cousins. So what does that mean long term? How do we stop people over time just drifting into the cities because they've had to go there for work? This is not the only thing, but it's one of the things that can, in fact, change that paradigm. And with the great benefits that country people have where they live, we all know that, that's why we live here. You add to that these economic changes that will filter through the economy. I think you can see what the end result is. Now, some of the climate change stuff I'll get into a little bit later because I'm going a bit longer than I thought. One of the other issues that was before the Hung Parliament that I raised and others raised as well in the formation of the government was that we have a referendum on the financial recognition of local government. I know a couple of councillors here, I thank them for their attendance and a few people that have been councillors. They would recognise the dire straits that local government, particularly country councils, can get themselves into over time because of size and scale and a whole range of other demands. The Howard government, to its credit, put in place a thing called Roads to Recovery. Very fair. Every council got its fair share. Every council determined where it spent it. No one whinged about he's getting more than me. Good stuff. And there's been a few programs like that. Some of the rollout after the global financial crisis was through local government, and they did an exceptional job. Now, there's been High Court cases where the capacity for the Commonwealth Government to direct fund local government is under risk, at risk. And one of the ways of overcoming that is to have a referendum. It should have been a referendum years ago. We should have accepted local government, particularly in terms of its financial capacity to deal direct with the Commonwealth rather than have the money washed by the states. I know Lisa's not agreeing, and I don't expect everybody to agree. But there are certain things that won't happen as well and as quickly if we don't recognise local government as not as an equal form of government, but to clarify this position where the High Court has deemed that there may be risk in terms of the capacity for a Commonwealth government to actually give money to a local government, and that would be to our disbenefit. Some of the achievements of the minority Parliament that I'm proud of anyway. The Health and Hospital Fund, $1.8 billion. For the first time, we were able to ring fence that because Tony Abbott and Julia Gillard both said country Australia had been ignored, hadn't got a fair swipe of the pie. So we said, when I say we, Rob Oakeshott and myself, that, how about we ring fence the Health and Hospital Fund, this $1.8 billion for country health services. Normally, country health services got 13%, 16%. Let's make up a bit of slack here and give them 100%. And that was a very successful program. 135 health services, all country health services, got some advantage from that particular fund. The other thing we did, including some health services in this electorate, the other thing that we did was ring fence in a similar nature the Education Investment Fund. Now, it was a fund that was put in place during the global financial crisis, so both these funds were sort of coming to an end. They still had money in them. There was $500 million, which was ring-fenced for country universities and TAFEs. Now, the University of New England, I think, got about $30 million out of that, and it is going into the construction of a $46 million operation. And the University of CSIRO and others are putting money in, and it will revolutionise the teaching of agriculture in a modern age in a country university. It probably has the capacity in one foul swoop, in a sense, to put New England University back where it was in the early 70s, where it was highly regarded in terms of agriculture, economics, rural science, a whole range of world leaders. This will be an enormous injection back into the system. The other 400 and whatever it is, 70 million went to, or is going, most of it's gone now to country-based education facilities. One of the other things we were able to achieve was an independent scientific fund to look at the way in which particularly water and the landscape coexist, and the impact of mining and coal seam gas on various landscapes. There's $200 million in that fund. There's a bit of argy-bargy going on with the New South Wales government this morning, as we speak, and that business about the Western Sydney coal seam gas announcement this morning by Chris Archer, and the vineyards and the horses being fenced off is part of that game. But I urge you to watch this spot probably for another 2 or 3 weeks, and you'll see something come down the line here that will put some real backbone into some of these agendas. There's a whole range of regional development funds that have been put in place, and I think people, even those that don't agree with me or Julia Gillard or Billy the Blogs, would recognise that the regional funding that's gone into regional Australia through this parliament has been unsurpassed in a whole range of ways. The Regional Australia Committee, as I said, first time any parliament's had one. Strange. Why wouldn't you? The various infrastructure funds that are there, and that is Mal Peters in the audience. Mal chairs one of the things that I was able to get the funding for, which is what's called the Regional Australia Institute, which is to look at issues relating to regional Australia, and actually have some money, there's about $8 million in the system, to analyse objectively what's actually going on and actually get real work done by for regional people. And I congratulate you, Mel, on the work, and Sue McCluskey and others are doing. I was also able to play a role in terms of the Royal Commission into Child Abuse. And in fact, I think we probably would not have seen it of the degree that it will be had it not been a hung parliament. Because parties, majority parties, tend to be subservient to major organisations, and churches are a major organisation. I think we were able, a few of us, to sort of stiffen the resolve of a few people and suggest that it might be a good idea if they actually bit the bullet on this and tried to rectify some of the issues that have been around for those people who have experienced extraordinary circumstances. A few things in terms of Inverell, if I could. We've been working, and John, the little bloke on the end, is particularly thank him for the work over about the last 15 or 16 months now with Bindery beef. And in terms of Inverell, Binderoo is very, very important. And I can't get into too much detail, but I can remember when the carbon tax was being talked about, Binderoo were a little bit critical that they thought it might have an impact on their electricity costs. I don't think there'll be anybody in this electorate, maybe one, that'll pay carbon tax. I don't think they'll pay it either. But Binderoo would be eligible for carbon tax. They would also be eligible for assistance out of the clean energy funds, which are funded by those who do pay the carbon tax. And Binderoo have done an extraordinary amount of work. I noticed Chris Davidson there, he must be just back from the States, eh, Chris? The team of people working on how to place that particular business in a position where it can not only embrace the future in terms of a positive way, but ring fence itself from external requirements for energy. And some of the biogas and biodigestion technologies that are out there now are incredible. They are incredible. And they will, I've got absolutely no doubt about this, they will have an enormous impact on a lot of country towns. And instead of when people were saying, oh, we'll drive the price of meat processing up, it'll actually drive it down. It'll actually drive it down. And if you don't have to believe me in terms of that, I was with JBS and the Brazilian operators at Dinmore and other meat processing at lunch with the other nine counties. They just received a grant out of the carbon tax money, $4.4 million towards an $8.8 million biodigestion facility. They will reduce their emissions by 81%. They save $790,000 in what they would have paid in terms of carbon tax. So carbon tax gone, saving. They will generate through other savings about $1.1 million per year. Tees, or there used to be Cargill in town, a smaller operation in terms of their biogas arrangements. They received $360,000 in a grant from the clean energy funds, which are funded by the carbon tax. They invested another $700 to make up $1 million biodigester. The payback period, they reduced their natural gas requirements and energy requirements and reduced their emissions, but the payback period was 2 years. 2 years. And what people are starting to see is that there's real business opportunities in some of these things. They're starting to look beyond, the bumper stick and see that this is a way of value adding to our country towns. Now, just the other day, and to slip it through almost unnoticed, 14 meat processors across Australia announced these things. 14 of them. Moving into clean energy, biodigestion, methane, what used to be an environmental protection problem, authority problem with slush ponds and smell, converting that into real positives in terms of their energy. So can you imagine a Binderoo that's not reliant on external electricity? What that would do to the capacity to plan a business? It's just incredible. Because whether, people will argue with 10% carbon taxes and increase their electricity bills, there's plenty of ways to show that that's not the case, but electricity prices will go up. They will be going up. So anybody who's potentially able to ring fence themselves from those electricity prices, irrespective of carbon tax, if Tony ever throws it out the door, there's still going to be these opportunities that will avail themselves. Tamworth Regional Council, for instance, they have a waste management farm where they used to put the water back into the river from their wastewater, their sewage water and all of the wastewater in the town. They built a farm some years ago and put in half a dozen centre pivots, to put the water on the land so it wouldn't go back into the river, so they wouldn't be charged environmental charges for dumping in the river. They're looking at changing that mechanism, and rather than growing grain crops, growing high density dry matter crops, and using those dry matter crops to produce biogas, methane, or one up from methane, depending on the biomethane. Whatever it is, it's an energy source. You can produce electricity or you can use it for gas. They're negotiating, I won't tell you the name of the company, but they're negotiating with a glasshouse company to look at co-locating with them. We'll use the CO2, the carbon dioxide from that methane process to encourage the growth of the plants they grow in the glasshouse, big glasshouse. These synergies are starting to develop. There's a couple of abattoirs across the road who are seeing what's happening in other areas and planting the seed that, if you were going to do that, we could maybe put some of our waste into your system and take heat and energy back. So the beneficiaries of all of that, and there's biodigestion plants out there now that will biodigest the paunch of a cow, creating electricity or gas out of what used to be a problem. There's a whole range of these things happening out there. So I don't apologise in terms of my role in relation to carbon pricing. It is always going to come. The rest of the globe will move. Whether we like it or not, it will happen. It'll happen not just because the Chinese and some others start to get a bit concerned about the health of their populations, but also because of economic reasons. And some of those, I think, have just given you a bit of a snapshot in our region, where the value add, the clean energy technologies, even though it's a little bit subsidised by the government, are going to be part of our economy. Now just imagine if Inverell could actually put on another shift because of those internalised changes. That's what some of the others are talking about. There's no reason why it couldn't be talked about here as well. Now, I congratulate the people who worked with Inverell, John and Chris and Dave Snedden and many others, and JR and the crew, for the way in which they've actually had a good hard look at this. It's big business, but there's potentially quite large payoffs. I'll just run through a number of things in this part of the world that I think may be of interest to you. Ed Evans and his Safer Gate. We've been able to help Ed, and you all know he won the Inventors Award for the Safer Cattle Gate. Everybody gets bashed up by forcing pens in stockyards. Ends up with a nose like Andrew Fuller. But Ed was able to come up with this invention that potentially will revolutionise the cattle industry. They're talking to other parts of the world at the moment, the US, Argentina, major cattle producers, processors in our part of the world and in Australia. So we've been able to help in a number of ways, helping get some money to try and commercialise the venture. Because just having a good idea doesn't necessarily start selling at the bullies. You've got to get out there. And they're out there now, and they're doing extraordinarily well, and anybody who can spread the word do so, because they come from here. We've also been able to help them a bit in terms of a $10 million grant, not to Ed, but back to the meat industry, the livestock industry, the transport industry, to try and ensure a safer place of work for the truckies, the washout pits, the various loading facilities. There's this fund that's available if anybody can show, and I think Inverell sale yards are doing that. I know many others are looking at ways in which they can be funded to improve the safety for their workers within the various sale yards. And I would imagine, I don't know, but I'd imagine there might be a few safer gates getting put into various meat industry or abattoirs or meat processing facilities. Boss Engineering, I think you all know about Boss Engineering and the sort of groundbreaking technology. No, I shouldn't use groundbreaking, but they're a no-till planter producer, and they build an extraordinary article. I've got to go to tomorrow afternoon for the next day to speak at a conservation field at Temora. The Boss Engineering will be there with their planters, and we were able to help them as part of what was called the Multi-Party Climate Change Committee, the deliberations through that. And I know a lot of people in this area didn't particularly like those negotiations. I got told it a few times. But the deliberations through that, I was able to free up $45 million to go towards a rebatable discount for the farming community that purchased no-till equipment or direct drill equipment if they're in graziers. With a view, now why do you want to do that? With a view to trying to create an impetus for change. No-till farming's been in existence for quite some years, but still a lot of people don't do it. It is the biggest adaptation to climate change that you'll see in dryland farming. In decent soils that will hold a metre of moisture or better, it is the equivalent, and this has been measured to be so, the equivalent of another 6 inches of rain as compared to conventional tillage. If you don't believe in climate change, you don't believe in carbon tax, you don't believe in the politics of it all, and irrespective of whether Abbott throws it out or throws it in, that money will go to encouraging people to make a change of technology. So on the 300,000 bit of gear, it's 45,000 off in terms of the rebate. It is significant. Now, I'm not sure of how many more planters they've been able to sell. I'll be asking them on Thursday, but I think with that and other planters as well, they're making inroads and benefiting, and other manufacturers of direct drill equipment for pastures are also benefiting too. Now, one of the spin-offs in that is the accumulation of additional organic matter in the soil. Now, organic matter is carbon, soil carbon, not necessarily a tradable amount, but if you increase your organic matter in your soil, you increase your water holding capacity, and then you get into the sort of drought strategies that we all need to be in terms of conserving water. I personally have a block of land that has been continuously farmed since 1977 and hasn't been cultivated since then. It's been no-tilled. If you looked at the sorghum crop on it at the moment, you'd say it's not doing too bad. So it's potentially, not only in Australia but worldwide, will have significant impacts. Other issues, even today there was a $128,000 grant to Bosch for, I think, about half of their solar paneling to get their energy costs down in terms of solar panels, and that came out of the Clean Energy Funds as well. Other issues that we've either looked at or looking at, the Evan Street surgery, there's some money there, it was $500,000, but there seems to be some issues in terms of the totality of it that people are working through. I know we've had other issues in terms of Ashford, the other volunteer, the New England Volunteer Air Transport that David Roach runs. We were able to get some money last year for them. We're working with the South Inverell Community Centre, I can't think of the correct title, to actually try and, I know council are very involved with it. We're actually, Paul King's involved with it. We're actually trying to get some money to make that reality as well, and there's some work that's being undertaken with Sunhaven in Ashford, and a couple of other things around the traps as well that I probably should say at this particular juncture. But there's quite a lot happening The trade training centre in Inverell, I think, was a good thing for our kids. I know that quite a lot of criticism in terms of the building education revolution. I mentioned local government earlier. I thought they were extraordinary in the way in which they were able to spend that money in a hurry. It did a lot of good. Did a lot of good in this area as well as every other council area. But I'm yet to go to a school where the principal or the parents or the kids for that matter say they wish they hadn't spent that money on our school. The global financial crisis, which was the stimulus for the stimulus in a sense, has enabled all our schools to get a degree of advantage in terms of some of their facilities, and that payback will be very much long term. How long have I been going for, Grant? Time to shut up? So there's a number of issues there. I think most importantly, though, the message is the strategic use of the country vote. And irrespective of whether I'm elected or not, that is not really the point. I would urge people to look seriously at what the Western Australian Nats have done. I'd urge people to look seriously at how they can use their vote much more strategically. As I said, we've seen how the Greens work. I think most of us don't altogether agree with them most of the time, but they have been very effective with a very low base. They've worked it out. Regrettably, country people haven't to the extent that they could. And in fact, I almost see an inclination for a flight back home. One of the dynamic things that's happened in our political system in the last 2 decades has been that this myth of the worker versus the boss, the union versus the boss, that's still been perpetuated, but it died a long time ago. It died a long time ago. And what we have now, and I don't think it's terribly written, but what we have now are 2 management teams who are vying to run the place for the sake of power. Now that's all very well, and that's why you see very few people actually believing in anything in our parliaments. They don't have to. As long as they believe in something that's different to the other bloke, and they've got a bigger foghorn in terms of telling them the other bloke's wrong or right or whatever. We've become trapped in that mechanism. Whether they're 2 Labor parties or 2 Liberal parties, they're both very simple. They invent differences. They would both like Gonski, and I didn't mention it. It is something that you should really have a good look at. If you don't believe me, go and have a yarn to people like Mick Lewis at Ashford. Just have a yarn to Mick about the programs that he's seen as a headmaster and other headmasters in those schools have seen over the years that actually help kids. You can measure it. You can actually see it. And they're special programs. They're putting money into the needs of kids. And the performance goes up like that. And if it's there for 5 years, it'll go like that. And then, as governments do, there's state governments in particular, it's the education state, they'll decide to cut the program. So the next group of kids don't get that advantage. What Gonski does is 2 things. And it does cost money. And if our kids aren't worth money, I don't know what is. You know, we can throw the baby bonus and a few other things down the toilet and put that money into real kid stuff. What Gonski does is it takes away this argument between the public system, the private system and the religious system. For the first time, the 3 levels of schools actually agree on a funding model. We've all played politics with that for 40 years. 40 years that's been the card to pull out. My kid will get less. My school will get more than yours. I'm entitled to that. The other thing it does is the funding
follows the child, irrespective of which school that child goes to. So if there's a child that requires need, they'll get more help. If that child switches school, the funding to help him goes with, and we all know what happens. If you let a child get into year 4 or 5 at primary school, you've lost it. And then you wonder why, we wonder why, people become disenchanted, don't like the system and play up, and end up in jail. All of those things start to play out. So, even though Gonski is money and it requires the states to play, I think Barry O'Farrell will. I think he will. And I think he may well lead the charge in terms of some of the other states to get this program actually working. It is too easy to have politics in education like we've had for 40 years. We don't need that. And if you, the major beneficiary of Gonski are country schools, and they will level out that playing field. And with the education revolution stuff, I hope that will, the buildings, you will see, you know, the education of our kids, irrespective of which school they go to, improve. So I might wind up there if I could, and if there's any questions, I'd attempt to answer them. I'd also might take on board the brains trust over here if something technical that they might be able to answer more effectively than I can. Thank you.